Hello and welcome. This is the history of Hollister, Missouri. I had requests from several people that could not attend the last presentation to be able to see this particular presentation that I did. So here we go. Well, the two people that really had an impact on the area, both Forsyth and Hollister, were William H. Johnson and Sarah Elizabeth Johnson. Mr. Johnson was an attorney in Springfield, Missouri, actually the city attorney for 1 year, and hated it so much that he opted to move down to Forsyth, as he thought that this was the area that was going to be quite similar to Joplin as far as mineral rights and timber rights and so forth. So in the 1890s, they end up moving down to Old Forsyth, Missouri. And here we have a photograph of Mrs. Johnson crossing one of the many streams. People didn't realize it took upwards of 5 to 6 days to traverse from Springfield down to Forsyth, because there really were no direct roads and you had to go through many valleys and streams to get there. Along the way, you had to find a spot to take a nap or sleep, and they were fortunate enough to have a wagon brought where they could sleep in the back. They happened to stop in this photograph where there was a bunch of sheep being herded. And then, of course, they land in the beautiful old town of Forsyth, Missouri. Of course, it doesn't look like this today, as it has been since moved up onto the hill. Well, they had a son named William W. Johnson, and Will absolutely loved living in Forsyth, so much so that when his folks decided to move back to Springfield, he found a way to stay back another year or so he could enjoy living down there. Their father and family, they all lived there in Old Forsyth, just south of Shadow Rock, which you can see in the background in the top photograph. And down below you can see them catching fish that were shoaling down by the dam on Swan Creek. Well, as I mentioned before, one of the reasons why Mr. Johnson went down here was to sell mineral rights. And we did have several successful mines down here, the mines of Melva, Missouri. We had King Solomon, the Silver Moon, and the Jesse B. But the other thing he was quite successful with was timber. There was lots and lots of timber down here, as you can see piled up here at the railroad tie yard here in Branson, Missouri. The rails were key to being expanded with timber, so they would ship all the way up to Chadwick for the Frisco, and eventually when the Missouri Pacific made its way in the Branson area, that would be lumber that was utilized to expand that line down to Newport, Arkansas. So how did Hollister get its name? Why in the world did we call it Hollister? Well, 1904, Reuben Kirkham, who was basically the kind of the second owner of a lot of the land down there, he had applied for it where his office was, or his building there at Turkey Creek on the White River. And the reason he picked the name, well, that's where his daughter was born, in Hollister, California, so he thought it would be fitting. So how do we get to Hollister without a railroad bridge or a proper footbridge to get across? Well, we had to take the ferry. At the turn of the last century, Henry and J.T. Berry and William and A.J. Hawkins were the two that were the most successful, having operations on the White River, ferrying people back and forth. You can see that there on the bottom that the cost was a whopping 10 cents a person, 25 cents with your horse, and if you brought a carriage, 35 cents. Now today that seems very trivial, but back then it was quite a bit of money. Here we actually see the big whopping fee of 50 cents for a 2 horses and a wagon. And we can actually see Elizabeth Johnson on the wagon coming across. In the background, you can make out the brand new Missouri Pacific Bridge crossing into Hollister. Well, the big deal that happened in Hollister was the coming of the MAINE Club in the orchards that happened around 1905. But to first understand this building, we have to go back to 1903, 1904. In 1904, of course, we had the St. Louis World's Fair, and every state in the Union would send a building. Well, the MAINE Club was no different. They actually had this beautiful log structure that reminded many people of an Adirondack camp, and they opted to send that to St. Louis. The State of Maine building was built in 1903. They started cutting down these logs and started shipping them to St. Louis. 23 rail cars in all. They actually had 20 Maine lumberjacks come along with them. It cost them $12,000, or about $315,000 today, adjusted for inflation. Logs were spruce and pine, 3 to 4 foot in diameter, up to 60 feet long. The building was 50 foot wide and 160 feet long. And the fireplace was 30 foot high and could hold up to an 8-foot log. It's a massive thing. So how did it end up all the way down in Hollister, Missouri? Well, we have to thank Charles Henry Hunting. Mr. Hunting was the president of the Third National Bank in St. Louis. He competed in bidding with a group of individuals that were going to move the MAINE Club out to Clayton, Missouri, and have a club out there. But his bid was superior, so he won and moved it to the Hollister area. In 1905, he shipped the building and 23 rail cars to Branson, and then ferried them over to Hollister, where they were taken by horse and wagon to the site. This was quite an undertaking, but it was quite beautiful when it was done. If you look here, this is a map that was actually done several years afterwards, but it kind of gives you a rough idea of where all this was laid out. If you look at down here at the bottom left, you can see Maine Hunting and Fishing Club. Now they owned Pear Orchard was next door, but they had several orchards and grape fields around there. This was a very rural farming area when this was first developed. Well, how do you get there? Well, if you did get over by ferry, then your next course of action was to hunt somebody down who had a wagon and some horses, and then they would bring you over there. There may be a hack driver around that would take you there. And of course, many people showed up dressed to the nines because it was an exclusive club, and come riding on their ass, so to speak. Ha ha. Well, once we got to the MAINE Club, we were very fortunate because William H. Johnson, who would actually end up developing and selling the land down here, he came down here with his family and photographed the MAINE Club in the first year it was open in 1905. So we're blessed to have these pictures of his family going there. These are some rare pictures of inside the MAINE Club taken by Mr. Johnson. In the background on the far left here, we can see that massive fireplace they were talking about, and you could also see it here in the bottom. And then we have the long corridor going down to the fireplace. It was a beautiful structure. Well, the other thing that happened is we had this massive orchard and pears and peaches that was right next door on the outside. This was another thing that Mr. Johnson was hoping would be successful as he was developing his town. He was hoping that the railroad depot that had yet to been built would be a great supplier of fruits and vegetables to people around the country and make them flock to Hollister. So they planted in these 240 acres 20,000 trees, and 9,000 of them were pear trees, and just row after row after row of grape vineyards. Here's a great view of all those grape vineyards that just go on and on and on. It's just this is one of the reasons why we have the wonderful grape festival in Hollister today. And of course, they had people there that picked grapes, but one of the fun things you could do, like a lot of people like to do today, is actually go to the orchard and pick them yourself. Well, the railroad's coming. Well, this is one of the reasons that William H. Johnson ended up acquiring all the land down there, as he did hear that the St. Louis Iron Mountain Railroad was going to be bringing a line through here. So he ended up acquiring this land. And he was blessed that he did. He started advertising down there fairly early on, even before he had the town laid out. Here we see a great map of the White River line. It basically ran up towards Kansas City and then down to Newport, Arkansas. The line basically connected there at Crane going into Springfield. So if you wish to make it faster down to Hollister, you would come from Springfield, connect at Crane, and then take the train in. Blasting the line was extensively done, especially heading into Arkansas, as they had several bridges that they had to, in tunnels that they had to construct. This was not an inexpensive line. The line heading further north up towards Carthage was a lot less expensive as it was flatter ground. We actually see that the tracks to Hollister were cost $52,000 a mile, or $1,348,000 adjusted for inflation per mile. Trying to get a government entity to do that under budget today would be nearly impossible. It has to be private investors that sought the riches of the land. In the bottom, we actually see something that is very unique in the railroad world. It's a blind station. This is an early station because A, there was no station there, B, there was a sign there, but it had no name. And what you can't see, which is quite interesting, is on the next slide. Next to that station sign, there was a mail crane to get the mail in and out. But what's more fascinating is that we actually have two coffins being uploaded into the train. So somebody died in Hollister and were being sent back to their family. So here we have the true beginnings of Hollister, Missouri. Well, with the Missouri Pacific Iron Mountain Railroad in, they were all but assured to get new blood coming in and out of town. But currently, the train just passed through. There was a straight shot down and a straight shot back. So typically you may have saw a train once, maybe twice a day if you were lucky. At the time, the main commodity to ship out was railroad ties, lumber, and peaches that they got from Perry's Orchard. And of course, the peaches down here are quite large, so they decided they had to build a station. Mr. Johnson, upon getting all this put into place, again, like I said before, he has really started to advertise quite a bit. Some of these ads would pop up in yearbooks and magazines and trades publications of the day. But he extensively advertised and then did write-ups in the newspapers promoting the area to get people to come to this new blessed land of Hollister, Missouri. Well, Mr. Johnson had been quite successful with all this, but he had been called back up to Springfield, and he was selling land up there. In fact, he was in the process of developing his own neighborhood called Meadowmere Place, and so he needed a go-to man who was going to live down there in Hollister. So at the time of laying all this out, he would talk Joseph Wilson Blankenship. He was a music professor, a teacher that had settled in the area, and put him up in his building that he built that we see in the background. And he would be the one that would take you out and show you the land and get him to start writing up the paperwork, and Mr. Johnson would finalize it. He would go on to end up being Hollister's first mayor. He lived in one of the oldest houses down there, the Hardin Warren house. It was at the basically the end of the street going out of town. Highway 65 actually runs through it today. They were there basically right after the town was founded, somewhere around 0607. The Blankenship family moved in. He had his wife, Nanny, their son, Espy. Of course, there's the professor, their daughter, Ida Jo, and then another son, Hugh A. Blankenship. And since he came to Hollister because he was losing his hearing, he still did some teaching, but he was also a sawmill supervisor, and then, like I said before, he became a realtor with Mr. Johnson. This is some early views of Hollister, sometime around 1906, 1907. In the background there, you see Mr. Johnson's store that he built, although it wasn't occupied outside of Mr. Blankenship selling real estate. We did have the Van Zetts and Jackson General Store that had moved here from Kirbyville. and it was doing a brisk business as it was one of the few general stores in town. Well, Mr. Johnson decided, hey, if you're coming to town, you're getting off the train, you probably need a place to stay. So he decided that he would set up Camp Johnson. And Camp Johnson had 15 tents. They were 12 by 14, double canvas, so you could raise a section of it up and get a breeze or keep the rain off of you. It was a wonderful camp. He did have a couple of stationary buildings. One building we see up here in the corner was actually the library slash kitchen slash dining hall. These pictures are actually taken by the family while they were staying there, and his 3 boys are down here in the corner, and up at top is a couple of people we'll be talking about here very, very soon that are close friends of Will Johnson. Well, this is a layout kind of showing what Camp Johnson looked like, and we can see that the train is already making its way in, coming over here from Branson. In the far back, we can see another lumber railroad tie yard that had been set up. The YMCA camp, that was given to them by Mr. Johnson. He actually gave them 50 acres right next door to Camp Johnson, and it was to be quite successful. It was there for quite some time. The YMCA camp was a lot more affordable place to stay if you were down there. Even when other entities were built, a lot of younger people tended to gravitate here because it was closer to the water and more in their keeping. This is one of the halls that they had down there. Of course, the American flag ever present. What do you do when you go to camp? Well, you swim, of course. Get out in the water and swim in Turkey Creek and the White River before it was dammed. It was warmer back then, of course. Today, with the damming of the White River, now Lake Taneycomo, is a wee bit chilly, but back then it was quite an enjoyable experience. And we can also see that people would get out and boat and canoe and just in general relax and have a great time. People from all over the country would come here to stay at the YMCA camp. So, who came here and really did a deal to make Hollister what we know today? Well, we have to thank Mr. William W. Johnson and Pete KITE. They were good high school buddies. They participated in sports together, and they decided that they were going to come down to Hollister and start their new life. So Will and Roland, or Pete as he's better known, they had finished 1 year at Drury College and decided that they probably knew more than the doctors and other pharmacists in the area because they were more worldly people having went to university, and decided that they would borrow $800 and come down to Hollister and buy the supplies that they needed to open up this general store. Their dad gave them the building to use, and Mr. Blankenship was still upstairs selling real estate. So it was a way to kind of keep an eye on each other, so to speak. The thing that was kind of disheartening is after the first year of being there, and they did pretty good. They had a little ice cream parlor in there too, and we'll get folks in there to come eat. But the very next year, the state of Missouri decided in their infinite wisdom that you needed a license to be a pharmacist. So Will wasn't keen on going through all that, so he decided to sell his interest to Pete. Pete worked with another pharmacist that was local and helped him get his license. And Will did the thing that he loved and he would love for the rest of his life. And that was being a guide, fishing, floating, hunting. Both Will and Pete would do it. And when Pete had time off, he'd come with Will and help him out. But they could make more money in one outing than they could all week there at the store. So there was a lot of times that they would just close the store early and take out and go out there and help people. But you had all these wealthy individuals coming down here from St. Louis and Kansas City and other places, and they wanted to have pictures taken with all this fresh game or fish in their hands, so they would pay them whatever it took to make it happen. We were blessed because Mr. Johnson's dad, William H., he photographed a lot of these pictures that we're now looking at, and a lot of these pictures you are quite familiar with if you've seen old postcards of Hollister. because these were the pictures that were utilized to make the colored postcards that we see today so much on eBay or people have in their scrapbooks. All the pictures are of Will and Pete just hanging around Turkey Creek and the White River. As I mentioned, Will loved fishing on the White River, and he took everybody who ever wanted to go out there, and they'd spend most of the day. And they would have wagons that would show up with horses to pick up the john boats he had made. The john boats were made locally there in Hollister, so the guy was happy to supply them. It's kind of interesting that we don't think about doing this today, but they would stack up several boats on top of each other and have the horses take them where they need to go, drop them off, and then somebody would take the horse to the other end, just like we do today with cars and buses. Now, of course, anybody could fish, and these people obviously thought they could just pick up any old stick and drop it in the water. But if you were going to be successful, you had to hire a guide. And Will was a crack guide, and there would be others that would come on down the line later, like Jim Owens, who was quite successful in this. But a lot of people would come down here to go fishing, and they did not leave empty-handed, and they were quite grateful. Well, when you were staying down there and living in that county, in Taney County, one of the things they had was a rule, and that was that you had to pay $3 a year for the improvement or building of roads. And Mr. Johnson pushed very hard for this, trying to get a better road from Kirbyville and then getting one over to Forsyth. And he thought by having a better road, the farmers and loggers would have a better way of getting their goods to the train station, thus improving the town of Hollister. The way you could get around paying for it was to submit yourself to 3 12-hour days of hard labor working on the road. Well, Will and Pete opted for that because they wanted to save their money. But there were a few that had the funds, and they would just pay the money. Well, one of the interesting things that was always been tied to Hollister is Turkey Creek. Well, the first owners of this land down there was the FORTNER family, and Granny FORTNER lived up on the hill behind where this bridge is. And a lot of people would go down there and get baptized, and they affectionately called this place the Granny Hole. And why was it called that? Well, after Granny FORTNER, that was where she went and did her laundry. You can see it a little better in this overview. If we look behind all the buildings where Turkey Creek wraps around, you can kind of see where the bridge used to be. Here are a few other pictures. The bottom two actually show the early version where it was just wood and some wire ran across trying to hold that wood up. The later one looks a little safer. But I get a kick out of some of these old postcards because on the top here it says along Turkey Creek near Springfield, Missouri. Folks, Springfield and Hollister are a little bit far away from each other, but you just got to know these things. Well, the love of Will's life was Irene Nora Everett Johnson, and she was a ravishing redhead that he just fell in love with, even with all the pretty girls that came through at the MAINE club down there and the daughters and so forth. He just couldn't quit thinking about Irene. Well, Irene's dad had other things in mind. He wanted her to be a refined woman of character and be cosmopolitan. And she was more of a tomboy. She liked being outdoors. She liked being with Will. She liked going fishing. She enjoyed dressing up in his clothes. And they ended up becoming very, very, very friendly. And they ended up getting married, mainly because they needed to get married. And it was done in a secret service in Springfield by a local Catholic priest. And as time went on and she was a little bit more showing, it was very convenient for them to now start living in Hollister, Missouri, and that's what they did. But she was quite the outdoorsman and really enjoyed being down there, so they couldn't be two better people for each other. Their first daughter that they would actually have down there in Hollister while they were staying either at the tents or they had already went to their house. We're quite uncertain on the timing, but there was a time where they lived a little over a year in Camp Johnson in one of these tents, as you see there with her daughter. So I'm not quite certain on that, but we do know that she was born down there. And they loved it down there. They really had no desire to ever come back to Springfield. Will and Irene were now married. Well, Pete had met May, and May came over here from Kirbyville visiting Hollister, and he fell in love with her, and they got married pretty quick. So now these two couples were the two youngest couples living down there that were quite connected with the town, and they enjoyed going out, and people love having them over for dinner and just talking. And they would go over to the MAINE club and have meals, and then pick some peaches and grapes and head back to town and go on with their lives, so to speak. Well, you have to understand, why did Hollister take on this kind of English world look? Well, Mr. Johnson hated the fact that most American railroad towns, when you came in by train, you saw the back ass of all the buildings, meaning you saw them from the alley. And he was contemplating on what to do. Well, like I mentioned before, he had done so well in Forsyth and Hollister and selling real estate in Pickwick and Hawthorne Place in Springfield that he was able to acquire the land for Meadowmere Place and put in these stone walls, stone columns. He built a few of these arbors that are covered, stone and vines, and decided this could be something he could utilize down in Hollister. So when he sat down with the folks that ran the St. Louis Iron Mountain Railroad, or MoPac, he convinced them that they should build this as an English stone station. And he had his good friend Norman Archibald Torbett design it for the railroad, and they did go ahead and decide to go with it. Now, this is the only railroad station that they had built on the line that was stone and stucco that had this look, and we are very blessed to still have this here today. These are some wonderful photos that Mr. Johnson took of the construction of the station there, and it's interesting to look at Hollister today and look at these pictures because it just seems so open and spacious, and now it's all filled in. Here's another view from the log cabin hotel that was going to be built up there on the hill in 1909. We'll be discussing that shortly. And here's another view as they near completion of finishing up the roof. And here's a great shot soon after it's done. They're just finished putting in the spur line on the side there and getting all the ballast put in place. So it's a brand new shiny station with brand new lines going through town. Over on the far left is the log cabin hotel that I mentioned. In the station, Arthur Clyde Chapman would be the station master, and all the supplies that you see there, the equipment that he had, is currently at the school or the College of the Ozarks in their museum over there, the Ralph Foster Museum. Do go check that out. So the St. Louis Iron Mountain completed everything in 1910. One of the things that they did that was really going to aid in making this a destination place, and you kind of have to look for it, but over on the far right, you'll notice that the track curves really hard to the right. It also kind of comes on the back end of the station on the other side. This is in the railroad terms what we call a Y, and this is a way for them to turn the train around without having a round table, and then that way it could be a destination. So you could catch a train in Springfield and come to Hollister and then go back to Springfield. No longer did you have to go all the way down to Newport and turn around. The station was quite a success. Many people came here. Now we had tourists flocking in like crazy because we had multiple places for them to stay, and another new event was starting to happen, which I'll discuss shortly, that was also bringing people in town so they could come see it. And here's a really interesting dichotomy of pictures. We have hack wagons and carriages and trains and Model Ts. So we could see that the times were starting to change. The Log Cabin Hotel was quite an impressive structure, much smaller than the main club, but still a beautiful place to go. It was built in 1908, so it was built several years before the train station was finished. It had 20 rooms, had a dining room. The first Catholic Mass in Hollister was actually held in the hotel because there was no other big building in town yet. They didn't have the church. The hotel, unfortunately, later would burn, and it would become the site of the current City Hall. Well, 1910, 1911 is really a big change in this town, and it starts with the train station, but then the second building that really got built after the same style, also designed by Norman Archibald Torbett, is the bank. Now, this bank here of Hollister was actually something Will Johnson decided to do. As much as he enjoyed taking people out for hunting and fishing and stuff, winter was a little bit slower, of course, and if it was too hot, people didn't want to be out. And now that he was married and had a young daughter, he needed a more stable income. So he opted to take their wedding present that was given to them by their father, or his father-in-law, $1,000, and pooled it with other money that they were able to get from other investors. And they started this bank with about $10,000 available for loaning. Here's a great view of the town of Hollister. You can see the bank there on the far right, and then at the very far right, you can actually see up on the hill, you can see the Log Cabin Hotel. And then in front of that would be the train station. The rest on the far left represents Old Hollister. And that's something that would soon change as Mr. Johnson in 1911 actually replotted and changed the town so that the streets would flip-flop. But I'll get into that shortly. Will and Irene finally, at the same year, also got a house. So they weren't staying down there at Camp Johnson through the winter in the crazy tents. Although they did have some more sturdier structures like the library and the place to cook and stuff. They did sleep in a tent. So now they had this wonderful house up on the hill, still there today, by the way. You see it as you're going out of town. Maggie May Realtors, actually, this is their house that they use. Here's another view. You can see the big stone wall. Again, this is something being picked up that was brought down here from Springfield from his dad's place there in Meadowmere. And it had a wonderful sweeping view down the line and the river from his porch. Pete Kite also built a house up on the hill, although his is a little further to the kind of northeast, and it's still there today. It was actually recently just a bed and breakfast. Well, as I mentioned before, we have all these grapes being grown out there by Perry's Orchard. What in the world are we going to do with them? Well, they decided in 1912 they would have their first Hollister Grape Carnival, and it was a big deal. The carnival was the first in the state. It was huge. A lot of people would travel in. There's reduced train rates to get in here to try everything out. One of the guys who really got behind it early in a big way is Professor Otto Kohler. Now, Mr. Kohler was a strongman, and he did a lot of things out east and was kind of a famous fellow during that time, especially in vaudeville and so forth. And he came here and set up his own grape orchard, and he also set up some tents and a place to go to kind of enjoy the fresh air and revitalize yourself. And he would stay and actually become kind of the honorary representative or mayor of Hollister for many years. Here we have another view of that festival. Again, you get photos taken. You can take grapes back with you and jams and grape pies and so on and so forth. So, like I said, it was a big deal. So let's talk about the town. So why did everything change? Like I said before, he wanted to flip-flop everything because he was really distraught that his town looked more like an old west town to something in Colorado than this refined English village he was shooting for. This view here actually kind of gives you an idea of what's changed. Well, the main street in the middle, which was Broadway, now is an alley. Front Street's the main street, and all the buildings now have to be of an English design and facing the depot. So when you got off the train, you had all these pretty shops and buildings to see. So that takes us to the English Inn. Ye Olde English Inn, thank goodness, is still in operation and a great place to stay. The English Inn, also designed by Norman Archibald Torbet. This was, again, an architect that Mr. Johnson used frequently. He was also heavily used in the Springfield area, as he designed Landers Building and the Hers Building and the Old Courthouse. There's many buildings in Springfield he designed, but he would be even more well known out on the West Coast in the Washington, Oregon area where he died. He designed many, many buildings out there, but I digress. Back to the English Inn. So the English Inn would be completed in 1912, and that would now give the inn, the log cabin hotel, and the YMCA in Camp Johnson. We have now multiple places to stay. Because Mr. Johnson was heavily involved with things back in Springfield, he hired Mr. Jaquette to come down here and actually manage the hotel farm. They would have several different managers over the years, but he just wanted somebody who knew the hotelier business. These were the views of inside the inn. Hasn't changed much. It's been freshened up and cleaned up and painted, but as far as the main view coming into the lobby, nothing's changed one iota. Now, we can't forget about good old Pete. Will, of course, he was in town. He was next door at the bank, and he had his good friend move in the drugstore from the old store into the English Inn. And May and Pete would be frequently seen there. And so with their store there and their house up on the hill, they were very content with life. This is the view from the log cabin hotel. Looking down, we can see the privy, or the outhouse, if you want to call it that, on your far left. And then the old bridge. Now that bridge there is sitting in the park over here where the Hollister mayor's office is, City Hall. You can see a small portion of it. Of course, then we have the bank hidden behind a tree, train station, and then the English Inn. We are starting to get a few more buildings to be built in that are of English style. Well, if you're going to be down there, you need to be connected to the outside world. So Hollister Telephone Exchange, set up in 1912 by Mr. Whitlock. It was in this building where I had the arrow pointing down. Unfortunately, this building has been lost to time. But we do have a picture of Mrs. Fred Baker at the switchboard. It looks like it has maybe 20 or 30 phone lines in the entire town, but hey, they're up and coming. The Grandview Hotel was up on top Presbyterian Hill. Well, Presbyterians decided that they were going to come down here and set up a place that originally it was going to be for women to come down here and be able to do Bible study and just be able to have spiritual discussions. So they bought 160 acres, just kind of next door to Hollister. And by 1910, they started working on everything. It took them a year or so just to build a road to get up there because it was quite treacherous, and they had to do some blasting and digging and build a bridge. But once they got up there, that particular spot became the selfie spot, if you will, of Hollister. Everybody and their brother wanted to get up on top of Presbyterian Hill and get a photo of the White River in the background. Well, once you got up there, you had to have a place to stay, and so they had several cabins. Their biggest little hotel, if you want to call it that, was the Bidawee, and that's there in the top left. They also had several cabins, and they would expand over between 1912 and 1922. They'd build more cabins, and they have several open-air halls, if you will, where they'd have where they would have their church service and have discussions. And so that was basically what you would see up there. By 1926, they thought they really needed a more permanent structure, so they built the Grandview Hotel up there on the hill. And it was quite a stunning structure. Maybe not so from the front, but the back was quite spectacular. So to get up there, you could either take this road, which wound around, and have somebody either walk up there or take a car or a horse. But they did provide these incredible stairs that actually today, if you were coming across from Branson, you would run into it because that's where the turnabout is there. They took out part of the stairs to get up there, but they were kind of dangerous. Once you got up to the top, besides having the view of just being up there, you could actually climb some more steps if you still had some life left in you, and get on top of this watchtower and look out. But the views from the Grandview Hotel on these covered porches were just outstanding. And we were blessed that Dominic Danzero from Springfield came down with this panoramic camera and shot this picture. There are very few photographs taken actually at the Grandview on this porch, so we're quite thankful that he did so. So I mentioned all those people before that were showing up at the train station. Well, a lot of them were coming down here to fish and enjoy life, and a lot of them were coming down here because there was things going up on Presbyterian Hill. But there was a lot of people who liked to come down here because they got wind that there was building this dam, and this was the first big dam that we had down here, and it was going to generate endless electricity. Mr. Johnson's original thought was that all this electricity would stay in the area, and people would bring factories and shops and businesses and different things here and build more houses so they could all be electrified. That wouldn't quite work out that way. But we did get the dam. So when you go over to the Forsyth area, where the power, just north of Forsyth, where the power site would be built, this view here, you can actually see them starting to dig. This is what it looked like way back then before they dammed everything up. Now, Mr. Johnson's hotel actually owned a boat, and the boat was called the Etta May. And this particular boat was one of many boats that would traverse the White River, soon to be Lake Taneycomo, back and forth, and go up there just to see them work on the dam. These pictures, it must have been a rough ride because this guy's sucking back some booze pretty bad. But the people would get in all sorts of makeshift john boats. Some would look like barges with steam engines on them. Some would be small motor boats. But they took all sorts of boats to get up there and back. What'd you do when you get there? Well, you went and seen how they were building the dam. We got to remember this dam was still being built by hand. We didn't have a lot of machinery. The one thing that I thought was quite fascinating was this tramway they had going back and forth for the employees and also for construction purposes. But this was something, if you showed up, they would take you across in this tram. Now, OSHA would have a cow if this happened today, but back then this was something that you could do and nobody seemed to care. Our great-grandparents were just a stronger, hardier bunch. And as we can see, the dam here, we can see this kind of tramway and then system they had going back and forth. But they would just bring stuff there by horse and wagon or with mules. And they poured concrete, but everything was just constructed by hand. There was not a lot of heavy equipment. Took them a couple of years. They finally got it done. But by 1913, it was up and running. And this picture over here from Johnson's collection actually shows the internal workings of the power site dam as far as how it generated electricity. Quite fascinating. This is a view that was actually taken about a year or so afterwards, and during one of those record floods of water spilling over. It just looks roaring to me. But would love to go see it when it's full of water. Well, as I mentioned before, Mr. Johnson still had his hands back in Springfield working on a lot of projects, and he was hired by Francis Xavier Herr of Herr's Department Store to help with his new project, the Phelps Grove Park subdivision. And they actually ended up having one of the top architects, landscape architects, George Kessler, who is called the Frederick Olmsted of the West. Mr. Kessler designed this park as a subdivision and designed the bridges and the entryways and so forth, and then handed it back to Mr. Johnson, and then they started to work on it. So he hired his crew, and they came in and built the entryways in the Phelps Grove, and then they modeled the pavilion after the train station there in Hollister, and it was also designed by, again, Norman Archibald Torbett, and it's also still standing, thank goodness. but the connection to St. Louis and Kansas City and to Springfield and Hollister is quite strong. The other thing that Mr. Kessler did that a lot of people are aware of, he redesigned Forest Park after the 1904 World's Fair, and he also designed many of the parks up in Kansas City. Mr. Johnson then also took this style and built a bridge that Mr. Kessler had designed to go across the Fast Night Creek that runs through Phelps Grove Park. And this would be a theme that he would repeat down in Hollister as well. Well, the other big person or big entity that would live in this area was the back then called the School of the Ozarks. And the School of the Ozarks was started in 1907 here at Mitchell Hall back in Old Forsyth, and they had laid the cornerstone on October 17, 1906. These are some very rare photographs of all this being materialized there in Forsyth that day. And after they got it built, it was mildly successful. They actually had a plan to have a massive compound of about 8 or 9 of these buildings. Unfortunately, they only built the one, and that was about all they could do as far as keeping students and keeping teachers, because it was so remote to go to Forsyth at that time. Mitchell Hall burns, unfortunately, in January 14, 1915. It was a $30,000 loss. They weren't insured for $30,000. That was the problem. They were insured for a whopping $15,000. So they got very lucky, because during all this of Hollister growing, the one thing that did not survive or do well was the MAINE Club. Very soon after it started, within the first 5-10 years, it kind of petered out and was reduced to being just a restaurant open 3 days a week, and then finally that closed. So it was kind of sitting empty. So the school needed a place to go. They went to them and they said, "We got $15,000 from the insurance company," and the people that owned the property said, "Sold, it's yours." Well, soon thereafter, they started expanding out there because a Mr. Harry Abernathy, who happened to be fishing, and as he came up on the hill and he came across the MAINE Club, he noticed there was a little girl sitting there, and she was very distraught. And he asked her, "Why are you so upset? What's bothering you?" And he goes, "Are you a student here?" And she goes, "That's the problem. I want to be." And he goes, "Well, what's the problem?" He goes, "Well, there's no place for girls to stay here. They only have dorms for boys." So he decided that let's go find the guy that runs this place. And he went and talked to him, and he donated $11,000 to him to build Abernathy Hall so the boys could move there and the girls could live in the old MAINE Club. By 1918, we see, as it's now was called, Dobbins Hall, and then we have Abernathy Hall across the way. 1921, we get Stevens Hall, which is next door, and then the next one would be the Green Building, or the Administration Building. All these buildings are gone, unfortunately. Just like up in Springfield area, things tend to burn, and in Hollister was no difference. One of the things they used to help maintain the logs is creosote, and they would soak those logs in creosote and slap it on there, and it had a tar paper and kind of composition style roof. And unfortunately, one of the ladies knocked over a candle, and next thing they knew, the room was in a inferno, and it spread through it like wildfire. Basically, within just a couple of hours, there was nothing left. They only had insurance for $10,000. This would not be rebuilt. But it kind of was, because in 2004, the KITE Center was built, and that's more towards the entrance. The Dobbins Hall, or the MAINE Club, was further in the back of the property. To get to it, the site today, you would basically go to the church and then turn to your left, or go straight out the door of the church and head to the river, and then you would see where the MAINE Club or Dobbins Hall once sat. The KITE Center is much closer for the general public to get to. It's a beautiful legacy of that original building from Maine. Well, they had an artesian well here on the property as well in 1920, and this water was bottled and sent up to Springfield, and the electric bottling company and or the Coca-Cola bottling company in Springfield would bottle it and then sell it to drug stores around the area. And of course, like all things back then, it cured everything. They found that very quickly. It didn't cure anything. So it ended up stopping in just a couple of years. Well, Mr. Johnson, WW and WH, few years have passed now and they've gotten older, but they were still in high demand for building, especially in Springfield. But down in Hollister, a couple of folks from Springfield decided that they wanted to have something that was quite unique. So Harry Warman, who was the vice president of the Frisco Railroad at the time, and his new young bride, Dorothy, they had good friends, Julie and Jude Simmons. He had married Madge Milligan Simmons, and Miss Milligan was connected to Milligan's Wholesale Grocery in Springfield. And they were well connected all over the state, had a lot of upper class friends that they contended with. Well, they both approached the Johnsons and said, we would like to have a kind of an Adirondack kind of fishing, hunting kind of place to get away to, and we've got just a spot. Well, they would go over to where Big Cedar Lodge is today. Long before there was a lake there, there was the creek. And so they decided that they would have houses built out there. Well, Mr. Warman preferred to have one on the hill, so they built the Warman House. And the Warman House was built in 1921. It's still there. It's been expanded, and Johnny Morris has done a wonderful job expanding out the back, but the main structure is still there. The internals are built with railroad ties, which were kind of ironic because Mr. Warman worked for the Frisco Railroad. Well, Jude Simmons decided that him and Madge wanted something a little further down, nestled in the woods, so their house later on would become the Devil's Pool Restaurant. And it is still there today, and I've eaten there many times. It's almost hard to imagine this once used to be just a couple's house, but it's quite a beautiful spot. The Johnsons did an absolutely wonderful job. About this same time, Will had already acquired the English Inn from his father, and he decided it was high time that the English Inn had a proper expansion. But before he did that, he had told the city and the county, I'm not doing any more expansion or beautifying or adding anything more till you pave the streets. So that's what they did. They started paving the streets down there, which are still obviously paved today. But along the time that he was building, they were paving. They would have opened up closer in the early 1927, but we had just this little problem occur, and that was the flood. And it was a doozy. And it was so bad that people still wanted a place to go, but it's probably the only time that you could go to the English Inn and throw your rod and reel out and try to catch something from your bedroom. But people did traverse up and down with their boats and get in and out. And because it was built so sturdy and so well, it had no impact on it as far as the water was concerned. But finally, in the mid and late 1927, the English Inn, as we know it today, was completed. The difference was that Mr. Johnson opted to move Pete out and actually move him into the new section, and that would be where the bar would be. Where Pete's drugstore was, that became the new built-in dining room, and where they had a kitchen and a fireplace. There's also these beautiful fish that are on the wall, and the Johnson family actually took fish they caught and then impressed them into a mold and then put that up onto the wall. Pretty cool. Those have all been redone as well. Hollister Drug, as I said, has moved into where the bar is. So if you go in there, people go there to get cured. Now they still go there to get cured. The English Village, the vision Mr. Johnson had, was really started to come into fruition in the 20s. And you can see this in this beautiful postcard taken by Mr. Cooker out of St. Louis, Springfield, looking down and seeing all the buildings that are there. Next door to the English Inn, we would see the first garage and kind of gas station in the area. You could pull your car and get tires done, get things worked on. Very convenient for people traveling. Then we'd have the gift shop at the Ozarks for quite a few years. A lot of people knew this as the Christian Science Reading Room. It's now vacant. Has this incredible beamwork and the fireplace, and there would be a wonderful building for somebody to take over. Next door is kind of a famous or infamous, if you will, building down there, the Blue Lantern Tea Room. Now, this has been an antique shop forever, and I remember many times going in there and couldn't find prices. Sometimes he wouldn't sell you anything and wouldn't bargain much at all. The family has inherited the antiques place, so I don't know what's going to happen to it, but it's still there. Next door, we have the Salisbury gift shop and the SAAD dry goods store, and then a barber shop. That barber shop, incidentally, was also the fourth building built on this street. Next door, we had a lunchroom, had billiards in the back. And then we had the American Inn restaurant and Morrison Toons hardware store. That building is still as it is. Unfortunately, the Hunt Brothers Grocery, we don't know why, has lost its top. And the building next to it, which is actually the U.S. Post Office, is also gone. At the very end of the street now is a bank. That was a bank there and now is a realtor. Well, that is part one. There's so much more I need to do in part two, but I can only talk for so long, and I didn't want to bore you to death. So I decided to end it here, and we will pick it up in the 20s, late 20s in Hollister, but I have other areas that we need to talk about surrounding the area that we hadn't even gotten into. For those of you who are not a member of the Taney County, Missouri History, Landmarks, and Vintage Photography page, please join. I will approve you. We have almost 3,000 members on that page, and many of the photographs that I have here are listed on there, and many others that other people have donated. So it's a great page to learn about Taney County. And with that, I thank you for listening, and especially since this is my first one, I hope you've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed doing it, so I would expect that you will be seeing many more of these to come. Thanks again, and look forward to part two coming soon.